When you watch someone playing jazz guitar, it can blow your mind how many different chord shapes you seem to need to know to play jazz. But there's a clever trick I want to share with you today. I'm going to show you by knowing how to play just a few basic chord shapes on the guitar, you can quickly learn to play a massive amount of different jazz chords without needing to memorize them all. But to understand how this jazz chord system works that I'm going to show you today, we first need to look at an important concept, the three harmonic families. Let's take the lead from one of the greatest jazz guitarists that ever graced the earth, the fabulous Joe Pass. Now, jazz harmony can seem very complicated if you read it from theory books, but from a playing point of view, Joe Pass was very clever in keeping things as simple as possible. He organised his chord knowledge in three main buckets. He basically boiled down to what was the essence of each chord. Was it a major chord? Was it a minor chord? Or was it a dominant chord? These are the only three types of chords in Western music when you really boil things down. Whether it's a complicated looking chord symbol like G7 flat 13 sharp 9, or whether it's C9 sus, or any of those crazy looking chords, it can basically be boiled down to just these three main chord types. So, chords can be boiled down to just three harmonic families: major, minor, and dominant. So, the logic goes, if you take this further, then if you know the basic chords from each of these three families, then you'll be able to play any jazz song that you like. And the quickest way to master these three types of chords is by learning how to play 2-5-1 progressions, as these progressions have these three main types of chords in the progression. The 2 chord is a minor chord, the 5 chord is a dominant chord, and the 1 chord is a major. Alright, so let's look on the guitar now how we can play this chord progression with some cool jazz chord shapes. Alright, so let's have a look at this 2-5-1 progression. We're going to do this in G major today. So the basic chords are A minor 7, D7, and G major 7. But let's start with the dominant chord, the D7. This looks like this. We've got my second finger on the 5th string on the 5th fret. Then I have my first finger on the 4th string of the 4th fret. And then finally I've got my third finger on the 3rd string of the 5th fret, making a little triangle shape. So by the way, if you're looking to get all the diagrams for the chord shapes that I'm covering in today's video, as well as all the backing tracks and so forth, then you can just click the link below this video and enter your details, and that will be sent straight through to you. So this D7 chord, this type of chord is called a shell voicing. It's got the bare bones of the chord outlined and nothing more. So we have the root held down by my second finger, the third held down by my first finger, and the 7th held down by my 3rd finger. So it's just the root, 3rd and 7th all played together. And keep in mind that you don't strum all the strings of the guitar, only the ones that you're holding your fingers down. If you strum all the strings, it'll sound like this. pretty funky, but what we need is just the notes that we're holding down with our fingers. And this is something that you'll usually see with jazz chords actually. So I can add extra notes to this shell voicing to make it sound more colourful. Now that's the issue with this sort of chord. It'll work just fine in a band, and often this is a preferable way to play jazz chords because you don't get any clashes with, say, what the pianist is doing, for example. But if you want to add a bit more colour, then you just basically have to add extra notes on top of this voicing. So that's what I meant in today's intro, is that you can get a whole bunch of different chord shapes just from the one basic shape by adding more notes to it. Now, the good news is I have a free finger. So I've got my little finger there, and I can place that on the 5th fret of the 2nd string, making a 9th chord. So if I only pluck or strum the notes that I'm holding down without any others, I get that kind of sound. So there you go. This is a lovely sounding jazz chord. Now we've made a D9, or a dominant 7 with a ninth on top. Now, you can play it like this, but you'll often see jazz players do this little technique, where instead of having two fingers holding down notes on adjacent strings on the same fret, what they'll do is they'll use a bar, and often it's with a bar with the second finger or the third finger. So if you guys are used to other styles like rock or classical, I'm sure you're familiar with bar chords like this, where you hold down a bar with your first finger. But in jazz, you often have to hold down bars with the other fingers. So let's talk about that technique. So let's say I wanted to hold down that E note on the 5th fret there. Instead of my little finger, I want to hold it down with my third finger instead. So I can put down the basic shell chord, and then I just flatten and kind of roll my hand over so that the third finger is playing across those two strings. Now, be careful here, especially if you're a classical player. If you try to have your thumb in the middle of the fretboard behind the neck, it won't work. It'll feel incredibly tense. You actually have to have your thumb up above the fretboard. Can you see how when I turn my thumb like this, it sort of clamps that third finger down? So you have to have your thumb quite a long way. At least for me, I've got quite a large thumb there. But to make sure that you're clamping down those strings with your third finger. So I get the same sound as with those two, but then using my third finger bar. Now you might ask, why would you do that? Well, it's because you have a free finger again to put other notes on top as well. Can you see how by using my little finger, all of a sudden I've got all these extra colors available at my disposal? So this is why third finger bars and second finger bars like this are used quite a lot in jazz to keep those other fingers free, because chord tones are very precious on the guitar. Unlike a piano, you have many fingers to play a whole bunch of different chord tones, but on guitar it's very limited. You've only got 4 fingers. Alright, so we've covered the 5 chord in the progression. Now let's backtrack a bit in the progression and play the 2 chord. Okay, so we've got A minor 7. You could play it like this with fingers 2, 3, 4. Depending on the context, there's a bunch of different ways you could play this chord. You could play it with fingers 1, 2, and 3. I don't tend to do that very much. You might think it's okay to just bar it with your first finger because all the notes are on the same fret. But if I've got a pick, you'll be hitting unwanted notes that shouldn't really be held down there. So it's much better, I think, to play it similar to how we played the D9 chord. If you move everything across and just have your second finger on the 6th string, this is all on the 5th fret, and then use the third finger bar for the 4th and 3rd strings, that solves a few issues, because it's easy to have that 5th string muted when you're strumming. It's just my second finger's lightly touching that 5th string so that it doesn't sound. And also, the third finger bar, kind of the end of that bar, is muting those top strings. So I can still strum the chord, which gives me a nice percussive sound, which is really useful for jazz. But I don't get the unwanted strings that I don't want held down. So there's lots of lovely different voicings you can get from this minor shell chord voicing. I don't have to be stuck on those fingers that I'm using. I could go back to, say, using fingers 3 and 4, and I could play a D note on the 3rd fret, which would give me a lovely A minor 11 chord sound. I could go back to this style and then put a B with my little finger up on the 7th fret of the 1st string. Get a lovely A minor 9 sound. I could even ditch that kind of tricky bass note there and just kind of play the top of the chord. Can you see how that's the same as this? I'm just ditching the bass note and using the top notes instead of the chord. That kind of technique is very useful because do you see how I've got lots of fingers free to put interesting interesting sounds on the top of the chord, but I'm not sort of held back by that bass note tying up my fingers. The bass player will often be playing the bass notes when you're playing in the rhythm section in a jazz band. So you don't necessarily need to hold down all these bass notes all the time. You can actually leave them off and play more with the upper extensions of the chords. That's a very useful tip, that one. Alright, so now let's have a look at the G major 7, which is the 1 chord in the progression, the last chord of a 2-5-1. So I can play this as so. I can go finger 1 on the 3rd fret of the lowest string. Then I have the my 3rd finger on the 4th fret of the 4th string, and my little finger on the 4th fret of the 3rd string. Now once again, be careful if you're strumming this to not play that open 5th string when you play this kind of shape. You're only aiming to play the notes which are being held down by your fingers for these types of voicings. So this is the root, the 3rd and the 7th of the chord. We've got the root here, the 7th and the 3rd. Now, I can keep that basic shape. I might have to change the fingers that are being used here, but I can play all sorts of different voicings. If I hold down that bar there on the 3rd string, instead of just playing one note, I could hold the whole bar down. Maybe use slightly different fingers to hold the other notes down, but I get some extra notes there. I can put an E on the 5th fret of the 2nd string with my little finger that's free now. I can put a A on the top string on the 5th fret. So there's a lovely variety of voicings that you can get by just adding notes to these shell chords. One more thing with major chords is I also find 6 voicings very useful, like a G6 in this case. So that would look like this, where we've got root note on the 6th string of the 3rd fret. Then I have my 1st finger on the E, which is the 2nd fret of the 4th string, and then a B on the 4th fret of the 3rd string. That sounds quite nice. And I can put the 5th of the chord, the D note, on the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. So that's also a very lovely sounding chord you can use for major chords, is using a 6 voicing. Alright, so let's use these chords over a backing track. I'm going to use a basic Charleston comping rhythm, which sounds like this. And I'm going to include the backing track that I'm using for this segment of the video, along with the PDF that you can get by clicking the link below. So make sure you grab those so you can practice these at home. Okay, basic shell voicings first. Here we go. Again. Okay, so now let's do the bigger voicings now. A minor 7 first. D9. G major 6. Okay, so that was a major 2-5-1 progression, and if you can play the chords out of that progression, you're 80% all the way there to being able to play any jazz song. But there's a few extra chord qualities that we haven't covered yet. Let's go back to the slides and I'll explain why. So going back to our 3 harmonic families, in jazz, you actually have subtypes of dominant chords and minor chords. If we look at the minor side of things, we have the minor 7 voicing that we've covered before, but we also have a minor 7 flat 5 chord. Now, the minor 7 flat 5 is a much darker sound, and it's kind of the darker side of minor, and you can really hear the difference between those two chords, as I'll show you in a moment when we get on the guitar again. But on the other hand, dominant chords have two subtypes as well. We've got the standard dominant sound, which is indicated by the 7 there, but then there's also the 7 altered sound. That ALT there stands for altered. So things like flat 9s or flat 13s or sharp 9s, those kind of tense notes that are applied to dominant chords give a very different sound and a much more tense sound to a dominant. So these are the kinds of sounds that we need to now work into our chord knowledge. And you can practice these subtypes by looking at another chord progression, the minor 2-5-1 progression. Let's have a look at that now. So now let's have a look at an A minor 7 flat 5 voicing. So we have our basic shell chord like this. I'll just use this fingering here. Now the good news is that A minor 7 and A minor 7 flat 5 share the same shell chord. So if you can't remember where A minor 7 flat 5 is, just use the basic shell chord that I've shown you earlier in this lesson. But what we can do to add a flat 5 into the game is to use my first finger and place it on the 4th fret of the 2nd string. So if I play that chord, so that finger is like that on the 4th string, I get that A minor 7 flat 5. So it's just an additional color on that basic shell chord voicing. So now let's have a look at an altered dominant voicing. So once again, let's take the D7 shell chord shape. Remember that little triangle shape? And what I can do here is add altered tensions onto this chord. So that's what the ALT means, or the alt means on that chord symbol whenever you see that. It just means basically apply altered tensions, notes that don't normally exist in the home scale of the key. So we've got something like this. I could flatten my bar over these notes, so I could have the 4th fret barred from the 4th string to the 2nd string, and then place my shell chord notes back here, and I'd get a D7 flat 9 chord. Now, likewise, I could use my little finger and place that on the F natural on the 6th fret of the 2nd string. So I've got my 4th finger there. I'm going to put my shell chord down here, put my 4th finger there, and I get a D7 sharp 9. All of these are valid altered chords. I could actually flatten my little finger and hit the B flat now. Well, that's a pretty spicy voicing there. I've got now a flat 13 there, held on the 6th fret with my little finger, and also that sharp 9. Or I could have the flat 9, remember that was on the 4th fret of the 2nd string, placing my shell chord down. Well, that's a lovely chord voicing. And now I've got a D7 flat 9 flat 13. So any of these kind of combinations will work very well for an altered chord. And this is something Joe Pass talked about a lot when it came to dominant chords. You really do need to add this kind of tension onto dominance, because it can create a lot of spice and interest in the music. If you leave things too plain, it won't really sound like you're playing jazz. It needs to have that spicy tension on those dominant chords. So now let's go down to the 3rd fret with a G minor 7. This is the 1 chord. Now the good news is the same shell voicing for the A minor 7. We just go down 2 frets and we've got G minor 7. Now in exactly the same way as we were manipulating the A minor 7 earlier in this video, I can place not altered tensions this time, because this is the 1 chord of the key, so it needs to sound very tonal and kind of, this is where the tension in the music relaxes. But I could place some additional notes on top by barring that 3rd finger. I could place a little finger on top on the 5th fret to get a G minor 9. Might be easy to play it like that. And then I could say put a 13 on using my 3rd finger. Well, that sounds lovely there. Another voicing that's useful for the one chord in a minor key is a minor 6. Remember how we were talking about 6 chords for the major chord in the home key, but for a minor key, the one chord, often a G minor 6 sounds good. Okay, so this is where I've got my second finger on the 3rd fret, first finger on the 2nd fret of the 4th string, then fingers 3 and 4 on the 3rd and 2nd strings on the 3rd fret. We've got that lovely minor 6 voicing there. Alright, so let's practice these shapes over a minor 2-5-1 progression backing track. And as a special bonus, if you click the link below this video and fill in your details, I'll send you a free backing track for this as well as all the other examples that we've covered in this video. So if you want a printable PDF of all the jazz chord shapes that I've covered throughout this video, as well as those bonus backing tracks, make sure that you click the link below, enter your details, and I'll send them through to you. Also, if you found this video useful, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel to be notified when my future videos come out. Alright, well that's all from me for today. My name's Greg O'Rourke, and as always, thanks for watching.